his stature and credentials. He is a very, very dear student of mine, like my son. Only thing, as a son, if he's expecting anything to receive, I will only leave him liabilities. But crores of rupees of goodwill which he already has. There are many feathers in his cap, and one of the latest one, he is now a confirmed COVIDologist of this country. He is a very important member of the task force, and you must understand that in COVID, very important, the task force is that every day new guidelines come, and every day the guidelines given by ICMR, WHO, BMC, Government of India, they are sometimes diagonally opposite, and they are so confusing that a practicing physician finds it very difficult. One credit goes to Shashank that he has simplified the entire guidelines, management structure, management principles, so that practicing physicians who deal with COVID patients will have no doubt. It's a great job that he has done, and for that he needs a lot of praises, and he does it relentlessly at his own practice, at the cost of his own practice. But today we are going to discuss, and he is going to discuss, a very important conference which took place in Chicago, virtual meeting, more than 22,000 delegates, and you will appreciate that it covers many things that we should discuss, and I'm sure I will just set the ball rolling. The highlights, there were a number of symposia which discussed many topics focusing the key aspects of diabetic under themes like acute and chronic complications, behavioral medications, epidemiology, genetics, insulin actions, and immunology, basic science. Then there were some interesting award lectures. Edwin Bauman Award Lecture, Role of Epigenetics in Diabetic Vascular Complications and Metabolic Memory, delivered by Rema Natarajan. Banting Medal for Scientific Achievements on Journey in Diabetes, delivered by Ila Ferranini. Kelly West Award for Outstanding Achievement in Epidemiology Lecture, the Epidemiology of Hemoglobin A1C. Then there are landmark trials, glycemic variability and progression to CKD, effect of insulin degludec on frequency of severe hypoglycemia in patients with type 1 diabetes prone to nocturnal severe hypoglycemia, very important. The HypoDec trial, nocturnal hypoglycemia with insulin degludec and glargine, U100 in patients with type 1 diabetes prone to severe nocturnal hypoglycemia, hypodegludec, a CGM study, update on current and emerging therapies, most important DEVOTE trial, GO-BOLA study, LIRA Prime randomized trial in primary care setting, and that is about most important in Carolina trial. So Shashank has a mammoth job from this large number of academic sessions of ADA 2020, which happened between 12th and 16th of June. I hand over to Dr. Shashank Joshi.
So thank you,
Dr. Shashank Joshi.
Thank you, Professor Boroskar. He has been a teacher, mentor, father figure to me. And today is Father's Day, so I have, my second father, who is Dr. Boroskar. So happy Father's Day to you, sir. And you have always been kind to bless us. And I have an idea of today is all courtesy Dr. Boroskar. He has always mentored me when I was a student at Grant Medical College when he used to take rounds at St. George Hospital. I still remember his clinics had wit, humor, but deep science. So Dr. Boraskar may externally look very witty and funny, but he is a very deep learner. He gets up at 4 o'clock. He belongs to the Kirana Gharana, and he's a scientist at heart and a very good human being, a clinician par excellence. So I am going to give a very tough job in the next 80 minutes. I'm going to summarize what happened. So 80 minutes of the 80th sessions of the ADA between June 12th to 16th, and that's what I'm going to do. So as Dr. Boraskar said, that we had 850 presenting faculty, 1888 posters, 2414 scientific abstracts, 47 moderated poster sessions, and the whole thing was virtual from Chicago, Illinois, but actually ADA office ran it as a virtual experience. So that's something which we know and we well. So what I'm going to do in the next 80 minutes of the 80th symposium is talk about the award lectures and path-breaking research which Dr. Boraskar alluded to, the landmark trials and existing and emerging therapies, ending with a big thing from Novo Nordisk, the once a week insulin, which we are all looking forward to be used in the near future. So let us look at the award lectures, and the big three award lectures are the Banting lecture, the Kelly West award lecture for outstanding achievement in epidemiology, and the Edwin Berman award lecture. And let us look at the first lecture, which is the Banting lecture, which Professor Eli Fernanani, many of us know from the ESD, very actively working with Professor Ralph DiFranzo, who we heard yesterday, and is going to talk on his journey of diabetes, and he has done some seminal work and cutting edge work in insulin resistance. Then A1C still forms a big challenge in informing medical practice. And what's the epidemiology of A1C? Liz Selvin, she is going to talk about that. And then we have Rama Natarajan, who is going to give us a lecture on cellular mechanisms of atherogenosis in diabetes, new insights in epigenetics, in the vascular diabetic complications and metabolic memory. So we know that Eli Fernani is from Pisa, Italy, and he's also attached to the University of Texas at San Antonio, where Dr. DiFranzo works. And his journey of diabetes is the journey starting with the understanding of insulin resistance. And the insulin resistance is seated in not just the liver, but the adipose tissue, the skeletal muscle, the myocardium, the smooth muscle, and the endothelium. So I would say the patch or the 5 fingers of insulin resistance from the Fernani fold are muscle, adipose tissue, liver, myocardium, smooth muscle, and endothelium. And this was his seminal paper, which was in 2011, which showed that under normal circumstances, the amount of glucose which is taken up under the influence of insulin during a clamp, almost 70% of the uptake happens at the level of skeletal muscles. So it's all when our beta cells are pumping insulin out, it is the skeletal muscle which is the first site which is actually hampering the uptake, and you have the GLUT4 receptor, and that is why the need for exercise in this whole phenomenon of insulin resistance. We also know that insulin sensitivity is progressively impaired when we progress from normal glucose tolerance to impaired fasting glucose to impaired glucose tolerance to over type 2 diabetes. And this insulin sensitivity decreases approximately 11 units per millimole, and if you multiply it by 18, it will convert into milligrams in an increase of 2-hour plasma glucose concentration. So even within the realm of normal glucose tolerance, there are individuals with a higher glucose increment or excursion during a standard dynamic test like a glucose tolerance, which are more resistant than those excursions which are lower. So actually, long time back I had written an editorial on subclinical diabetes, stage 1, 2 and 3, and a fasting about 90 to 99 is stage 1, 100 to 109 is stage 2, and 110 to 124 is stage 3 of that pre-diabetes stage of fasting blood glucose. And in each stage, you will see this insulin sensitivity is blunted, as Fernani said. The other thing is that hypertension is an insulin resistant state in peripheral tissue. We know there is an inverse relationship between mean blood pressure and insulin sensitivity, which extends even in normotensive range. And overall subjects, the fraction of increase in the mean blood pressure in non-diabetic obese subjects as compared to the lean subjects is independent of insulin resistance. We also know that beyond skeletal muscle, the second site is the adipose tissue, and there is a whole body lipid oxidation in the insulin resistant subject compared to the insulin sensitive subjects. So this classical Randall cycle of type 2 diabetes, which Firnani very elegantly described 15 years back, showed a reciprocal association between blood glucose levels and lipid oxidation. If you see the green, and you can see that the beta hydroxybutyrate is going up, and on the red you can see the glucose oxidation is going down, and you can very clearly see between the resistant individuals on the left hand side and the sensitive individuals the lipid oxidation. And clearly we know that the pathophysiological basis for predisposition of susceptibility of individuals to ketosis and ketoacidosis is determined by this threshold. So remember, it is the body's adipose tissue which essentially decides the ketosis and the ketoacidotic threshold. Some individuals develop it, some individuals don't, and that is programmed here. That is the seat in the adipose tissue. The other big thing is that we know there is a big debate: is it metabolism, is it perfusion? And when you look at insulin sensitive versus insulin sensitive resistant states, there is a insulin mediated glucose uptake in skeletal muscle. This is a cellular phenomenon, while adipose tissue is dependent on perfusion. So one is the adipose tissue, the fat is all about perfusion, and we know that if it is abdominal fat, if it is intraperitoneal fat or the femoral fat, it is that adipose tissue. So it is a drop of the fractional glucose uptake in muscles in insulin resistant subjects is not due to insufficient perfusion. It is due to the metabolism. It is because of the exercise stimulated blood flow in excess of metabolic demand to the same extent to insulin sensitive subjects. So when it comes to muscle, it's a glut for its metabolism. When it comes to the fat, it's all about a cellular phenomenon of perfusion, and it is the big debate. So muscle is metabolism, glut for exercise. Fat tissue is all about perfusion and all about the insulin resistant state of NEFA and beta oxidation and ketosis. The third seat of insulin resistance, which Professor Farnani's group has done very elegantly, is the fat. In fact, most people think, and yesterday we heard Professor DiFranzo saying that fat is probably the primary seat of insulin resistance, and we know that the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is the seat. So we know when there is adipose tissue lipolysis, a lot of free fatty acids are pumped out. When we eat a lot of fat, lot of carbs, you get steatosis, we get fatty acid, and we get de novo lipogenesis, which actually pumps up. So what is steatosis? Steatosis is nothing but fat in the hepatocyte. It increases the delivery of circulating lipids in the liver due to a reduced anti-lipolytic effect of insulin in the adipose tissue. And that is what really the insulin does. The basal insulin at night, which we give, which is bedtime, there's a lot of hepatic glucose diarrhea at night. And we all know that if you want to switch it off, you can use metformin, but the fastest switch off to the hepatic glucose diarrhea, which occurs at night, to control the fasting level next day, is actually basal insulin. And if we get a once a week basal insulin, that would be the most important impactful situation which we know. The new seat of insulin resistance is myocardium. Diabetes is a vascular disease. We know that myocardium kills, and it is the myocardial insulin resistance, and heart failure is now so much discussed. It is all linked to the myocardial insulin resistance, which is one of the reasons for the reduced ejection fraction with long-standing diabetes. So when there is resistance to insulin mediated glucose disposal at the level of whole body, there is a parallel insulin resistance at skeletal muscle and myocardial muscles, which are independent of the blood flow. And clearly Professor Farnani has shown that it is a myocardial glucose uptake which is abnormal, and this is the myocardial insulin resistance, which makes the the heart failure, whether it is reduced ejection fraction or even the diastolic dysfunction. The fifth target, Fernandez patch, Fernandez 5, are smooth muscle and endothelium. It is the vascular resistance in type 2 diabetes, and we all know that the vascular dysfunction, endothelial dysfunction, as shown here very typically by acetylcholine blood flow or the flow mediated dilatation, clearly shows a downward shift in the dose response curve and severe presence in insulin resistance. So obviously these are the 5 seats of insulin resistance, and clearly the skeletal muscle, the adipose tissue, the liver, the myocardium, the smooth muscle and endothelium, and the muscle is impaired, the adipose tissue is impaired, the liver is impaired, myocardium is impaired, and the smooth muscle and endothelium is impaired. So that is about the 5 Fernandez sites of insulin resistance. But the journey continues, because it's just not insulin resistance at those 5 sites, it's also to do with the beta cell which is stunned, which is dysfunctional, which is inappropriate. And he has shown in his elegant experiments which he has published the beta cell journey. And here you can see we have now data from bariatric surgery. And if you take type 2 diabetics who undergo bariatric surgery and you study their beta cell function, 1 year after surgery, when weight has stabilized, beta cell is on an average only 30% that of non-diabetic controls, which means a substantial fraction of beta cell dysfunction of long-standing diabetes cannot be reversed by surgical approach. So once you have a long-standing diabetes and the beta cell is dysfunctional, it is not easy to make it recover. So obviously the journey of diabetes doesn't end until we deconstruct the links between metabolism and complications, until we unify pathophysiology of type 1 and type 2, until we curb obesity, until we fully implement a new pharmacological methods to treat diabetes, and until we learn better how to prevent diabetes. So that was Professor Fernandez, 5 points, and his journey of diabetes. He's a living legend. Many of us have personally met him. He comes to India quite often for the EHD courses, ESC courses, and his journey of diabetes. Let us move on to the new moving target of A1C in the times of time in range. We are in the times of time in range, but Elizabeth Selvin from Johns Hopkins, which is the mecca of public health, which is the seat of COVID exercise in public health, well, they are also experts in A1C epidemiology. And what she talked about is what is the history of A1C, what is the impact of A1C on glycemia and long-term outcomes, what are the controversies of A1C diagnosis, can fasting and A1C come together, can CGM and A1C come together, and what are the implications. So we know it was Samuel Rabar in 1968, which is almost 52 years back, described that A1C is elevated in the setting of diabetes. And he published this in Clinical Chemistry Journal. And it was Koenig et al. In 1976, which actually told us that A1C reflected the average exposure of blood glucose to the lifespan of the red blood cells. And in 1976, it became a tool for monitoring glucose control. So in the good old days, when we were students of Dr. Boraskar, we used to do urine glucose. There was no A1C. Then we started doing fasting and postprandial glucose. And then came the whole journey of A1C. So historically, A1C was only a glucose control for already diagnosed. And the barrier to A1C was lack of standardization of A1C assays. Since 2005, standardization was not an issue at all because NGSP came in a big way. And this National Glycohemoglobin Standardization Program standardized the assays. And if you see the United States, they have these large communities of atherosclerotic risk communities, the ERIC study. And you can see here that this was a prospective cohort of 50,000 black and white middle-aged adults in 4 US communities. And this was Dr. Selvin's work, which clearly showed that if somebody has an A1C above 6%, they are high risk of developing diabetes, severe outcomes and death. A1C is superior to fasting blood glucose for assessment of prognosis. This was published almost 9 years back, and this established a link between A1C and future vascular deaths, initially in a non-diabetic population. So clearly, the work Professor Elizabeth Selvin did from Johns Hopkins showed that A1C in a non-diabetic adult is associated with retinopathy and kidney disease, and this was supporting the A1C as a diagnostic test. What are the advantages of A1C in diagnosis? It is not affected by acute factors. It is already a guide to adjust treatment. It is associated and linked to outcomes. Don't need fasting or time samples. Better index of overall glycemic exposure and much less like glucose variability. And this was in 2010 when David Nathan put out this paper that A1C above 6.5 should be using a laboratory using NGSP certified and a standardized DCCT assay. This was recommended for diagnosis. But there were challenges. For example, we are in India, we have hemoglobin traits which interfere with interpretation of A1C assays, which is not true for majority of HbA variants. There are some conditions which interfere with HbA1c results like altered red cells turnover, like hemolytic anemia, transfusions, pregnancy, major blood loss. It is expensive, and in African Americans, the higher levels are a limitation in diagnosis. So even in India, we have the same challenges. But consistent data after that was published to show very clearly by STEM, Professor Selvin's group, that there was no evidence of racial difference in A1C and complications of diabetes. And until 2019, that there was recommending of guidelines that they recommend repeat testing of the same test or new blood sample at a second point of time. And if you have a combination of elevated fasting and A1C from single blood sample, that has a very high positive predictive value to identify undiagnosed diabetes. So if your fasting is high, A1C is high, it is near certain. So 2019, they said that unless there is a clear hyperglycemic crisis, diagnosis of diabetes needs two abnormal results: fasting and A1C from a single sample, fasting more than 126, A1C more than 6.5 from a single sample is sufficient for establishing diagnosis of diabetes. But then came the range of time in range. We have so many experts who talk on time in range, and CGM became order of the day. So everybody said, let's move beyond A1C. Let's just use CGM. That's not true. CGM has limitations which A1C doesn't have, and therefore CGM mean glucose is not perfectly correlated with A1C. Never go by AGP or CGM A1C value. It is a gross misrepresentation from the interstitial fluid. It's a mathematical formula which is never accurate, and we need little bit of both. So obviously, what are the strengths and limitations of CGM? Well, latest evidence is that you don't need finger stick. It's an interstitial glucose every minute or few minutes. Short-term variations can be seen and very useful for type 1 diabetes. Problems: expensive. Concordance with venous glucose is only moderate. There are poor accuracy with low blood glucose values. Variability within and across sensors. Utility of type 2 diabetes is not very clear, not linked to outcomes, and too much of information which can lead to a clutter and sometimes even generate the CGM anxiety syndrome, which is very common in some of the type 2 diabetic patients. So according to what she said, and I think that's a very fair statement, these are complementary tests. Beyond A1C movement is a false dichotomy. I think the right way, she said, Dr. Selvin, is better together, and I think that's something very apt for India also. We are having now this interventional group of diabetologists which are very, very aggressive, but remember that you need little bit of both. And I think even everybody is now realizing all over the world that A1C is an equally important critical biomarker with the new technology. So A1C is still central to diagnosis and management, while CGM captures different aspects of glycemia. Neither A1C nor CGM are perfect, and if they are together, they are strength. So once we work together as one team, stronger the better, together the better, and that's the better together movement. So obviously, summarizing Dr. Selvin's talk, the epidemiological analysis clearly shows that there is a link between A1C and future risk of major complications, particularly in the non-diabetic population. And the two tests, fasting and A1C from the same blood sample, is sufficient. So these are the two major changes which happened by Dr. Selvin's work. First, A1C as a part of diagnosis 2010, 10 years back, and just last year it was the two samples. Are there racial differences? Yes. Even India will have racial differences, and that's why we may not necessarily need to use an HPLC technique. We might need to use immunodermatologic technique. So obviously there's strong link to outcomes. CGM is a very, very good tool, but should not replace A1C. We should use them together and do more epidemiological studies with both for a sound epidemiological thinking. The third big lecture at ADA is the standard, and if you have not read this book, Epidemiology of Diabetes and Vascular Lesion by Kelly West and Harry Keene, which was the WHO said, he was among the earliest attempts to bring the order of a unruly, often ill-conceived studies in diabetes and its consequences in human populations. So Kelly West published his book in 1978 and said that there has to be a standardized definition and technique for revealing the epidemiological aspects, and all these CVOT trials probably which we see today have the bearing on the epidemiology of diabetes and vascular lesions from Kelly West's work. So let us look at the Kelly West lecture which we just saw, and Dr. Selvin told us the impact of A1C. The third lecture is by Dr. Rama Natarajan on the cellular mechanism of atherogenesis in diabetes and really the role of epigenetics. And let us look at Dr. Natarajan's lecture here, and you can see here that very nicely Dr. Rama has summarized type 1 and type 2 diabetes, increasing prevalence, accelerated complications. We are seeing a rapid increase in recent years, including teenagers, because they are eating too much and doing too less exercise. There is a fourfold increase in complications: cardiovascular and renal, atherosclerotic and hypertensive, and renal and DKD and cardiorenal. Complications in diabetes are on the rise despite of good glycemic control. So genetics cannot explain it. It's all about non-coding RNAs and epigenetics, and their role needs to be explored. So is it metabolic memory? Is it epigenetic changes? So conventional arm is still paying the price, but the intensive arm is reaping all the benefits of epigenetic changes. Whether it is a DCCT and 30-year follow-up of EDIC in type 1 diabetes, whether it is 21-year follow-up of type 2 diabetes in STENO 2, you can clearly see that if you hit hard, hit early, and do aggressive glycemic control early, then that metabolic memory or epigenetic changes which are induced in the intensive arm make a difference. And what is this new science of epigenetics? And you can very clearly see that layer on top of genetics and genes. It is altered by environment, it is affected by behavior and disease, and basically epigenetics means it is heritable, mitotic or meiotic in the gene. So when an expression of that change will occur without a change in the underlying DNA sequence, that is called as epigenetic. So if you see identical DNA and consider identical twins, twin A methylation, twin B no methylation. So DNA is not your destiny, okay? DNA is something which we get, but if you methylate that DNA, it modifies the transcription of the genes either by altering the binding of transcription factors or recruitment of repressive proteins. So that's really the key. If you really see, it's all about the methylation, it's all about the alteration of the binding of transcription factors or recruitment of repressive proteins, and that's what DNA methylation does, and that's what is the science of epigenetics. So we know that today we have diabetes as an inflammatory disease, and we all know that there is increased inflammatory gene expression. We all know migration and proliferation of diabetes smooth muscle cells, and if you look at the mice study here, very clearly you can see, and this was Dr. Natarajan madam's work, very clearly seeing that there is a persistent dysfunctional behavioral of vascular cells, increased inflammation due to metabolic memory phenomenon, and this is the inflosome of epigenetic modification. And if you see that further, you can very clearly see that the plaque area remained increased in the previously hyperglycemic mice. So more is the glucose, more is the hyperglycemia, which is persistent and sustained, the likelihood of the plaque area being higher is more. So clearly epigenetics is the key driver in the human metabolic memory, and this was a hypothesis. The hyperglycemia promotes epigenetic changes and persistent leads to metabolic memory. And if you do an epigenome profiling, EVAS, in blood cells of type 1 diabetic patients followed up from DCCT and EDIC, cases from the former DCCT conventional group currently experiencing complications like retinopathy, nephropathy, macrovascular during EDIC, and controls from DCCT intensive treatment group not showing progression of complications in EDIC, and they were looked at. And clearly you can see that there is a distinct methylation in type 1 diabetes and complications from the DCCT EDIC group. There is a persistent of DMA DNA mem or DNA methylation from the EDIC baseline to EDIC years of 16 to 17, and there is a clear connection between epigenetics and metabolic memory, and you can very clearly see here the DCCT intensive group which doesn't progress into complications compared to the DCCT conventional group which progresses into complications using the DNA me array assays. And clearly there is a direct relationship between DNA methylation variations, human metabolic memory, supporting the role of epigenetic mechanism in the human metabolic memory as evidenced by these CGP DNME studies on the DCCT entry closeout, and this is the hypo DNME or memory in WBCs of cases versus control over 17 years follow-up, or the TXNIP 3' UTR, and that's something very well known. So the persistent DNA me difference at the key CGP sites like TXN NIP from the EDIC follow-up gives us the explanation for the human metabolic memory and re-endorses the concept hit hard, hit early in the first 10 years of a diabetic's life, and that is the epigenetic genetic life cycle. So we all know, and we all know this very clearly, that the germ cell epigenetics basically will lead to altered chromatin, DNA methylation, histone modification that will lead to an adverse intrauterine exposure, that will lead to a postnatal environmental factor and adult metabolic disease. So it is all about the DNA methylation kinetics which occur in the intrauterine environment, which has been elegantly published by various authors starting from Barker's, Caroline Fall and many others from India, including the Mysore cohort and the Pune cohort, very clearly has shown that this whole phenomenon of the fetal origins or developmental origins of adult disease have some epigenomic links. So clearly Professor Rama Natarajan shows that if there is a history of glucose which is in excess, it will induce a dianyl methylation chain in various loci including the TXNIP and others. This is a mediator between the hyperglycemic history in the past and future development of complications. These changes might occur mainly in the hemopoietic stem cells. These are epigenetically maintained in different myeloid and other cells to facilitate metabolic memory, and sustained vascular complications are likely through modifying enhancer activity in nearby genes. So her take-home message was very simple. Pathological genes alteration by chromatin marks, chromatin accessibility, DNA methylation has gone up. There's a lot of crosstalk between epigenetic layers which lead to metabolic memory and sustained macrovascular complications. Unlike genetics, which we can't change, epigenetics is reversible because we have opportunity for therapy, clinical implications for personalized medicine is used, and epigenetic variation and epigenome profiling is possible. So remember, this is something which we can reverse, we can change the environmental influence, and we can make a difference. Let me quickly go over landmark trials and then some existing and emerging therapies in the next 35-40 minutes. Well, the landmark trials are many. This is just a small, quick summary of some of them. Like the relationship between hypoglycemia and cardiovascular mortality in outcomes of the Carolina trial. Then the Liraglutide, which is a randomized primary control setting trial of liraglutide versus OAD in type 2 diabetic patients who are not on control. Then the Conclude trial, which is looking at degludec and glargine. And then of course you have the dulaglutide kidney function related outcomes, the analysis from the Rewind trial, and glycemic variability and progression of CKD trial, the Pearl sub-study. So this is the relationship between the Carolina trial. Julio Rosenstock said that we know hypoglycemia and severe hypoglycemia drives cardiovascular risk factor, and we know this very well that it's linked to the intensive group. And if you look at this whole arm of 3-point MACE of linagliptin versus glimepiride, it was neutral, clearly it was neutral. But if you look at the statistical analysis of hypoglycemia versus outcomes, you can see that there's a lot of hypoglycemia and severe hypoglycemia which was seen but did not impact the hypoglycemia, particularly from the glimepiride arm. So also if you look at the baseline characteristics between the linagliptin arm and the non-linagliptin, the glimepiride arm, with participants with hypoglycemia and without hypoglycemia. This was the difference, and you can see the albuminuria had some challenges and difference. So clearly, what was presented by Dr. Rosenstock was those who experienced hypoglycemia had been randomized to linagliptin, had pattern of characteristics with higher hypoglycemia, longer duration of diabetes, poorer renal function, higher prevalence of albuminuria and macrovascular disease. While those randomized with glimepiride had lesser apparent function, a pattern that could identify elevated risk of hypoglycemia. So that could be an outlier, we don't know. This can be debated, but clearly if you see the hypoglycemia with CV outcomes and mortality, if you adjust it to multiple variables, you can see a higher risk for all-cause mortality and non-CV mortality. But this is very, very provocative, and very clearly he concluded that occurrence preceding hypoglycemia has higher risk of all-cause mortality and non-CV mortality, and the relative effect of linagliptin and glimepiride on any CV outcome or mortality outcome is not influenced by antecedent hypoglycemia. So obviously hypoglycemia matters, but whether it impacts CV or mortality outcome, we don't know. But there is a clear link that higher is the risk of antecedent hypoglycemia, there is a link to non-CV mortality and all-cause mortality. So obviously the expert opinion is results of Carolina were disappointing to some because there was no CV benefit associated with use of linagliptin, and glimepiride, despite of less hypoglycemia in linagliptin treated patients. A more detailed analysis of relationship between antecedent hypoglycemia and CV risk of Carolina interestingly did show a higher all-cause and non-CV mortality, but not for MI, stroke and CV mortality in patients with prior hypoglycemia. So again, there was no link to causality. There was some suggestions, but this was something which was being deep dived. What about Liraprime? Liraprime is a randomized control in primary care. See, we are not using GLP-1 in primary care, and that's something which people are wanting to use it. So this was 1.8 liraglutide versus OAD, metformin, and then randomized for 2 years. The objective was to get to an A1C below 7% and look at the efficacy head-to-head of safety efficacy of liraglutide versus OAD for 2 years. Clearly, this was something which people want to do, and people want to get better glycemic control early and see how things are. The secondary endpoints were A1C below 6.5, A1C fasting and body weight, and look at various adverse events. Clearly very similar groups which were seen: 57-year-old diabetics who are around 90 kilograms, BMI around 33, duration of diabetes around 7 years, A1C around 8, metformin 1.5 grams in almost 90%, and predominantly well balanced on the gender. The distribution of agents was gliptins, SGLT2s, small percentage on SUs, very, very small percentage on alpha glucosidase inhibitors. And clearly you can see a hazard ratio on the glucose control. Liraglutide clearly at 55% and all the other OADs at 42%. So hazard ratio of 0.58 clearly coming out very clearly. And obviously you can see the time to premature discontinuation for any reason due to inadequate glycemic control. You can see the consistent impact of liraglutide on the treatment difference, whether it's A1C, fasting glucose, body weight or BMI. So liraglutide is a true game changer after LEADER trial. Of course, we don't use it very often. We don't combine it appropriately. But in type 2 diabetics, if you use it appropriately, efficacy to efficacy, clear data to show that metformin is not adequate and compared to liraglutide. The time to inadequate glycemic control was significantly longer for liraglutide compared to other OADs. So if you use liraglutide, your A1C will remain in range for say 109 weeks compared to the other agents like a gliptin, SGLT2, only 65 weeks. That's something for us to recognize. After 104 weeks, fewer subjects discontinued due to inadequate glycemic control with liraglutide, 41% versus 55%, again statistically significant. Time to premature treatment discontinuation was significantly longer with liraglutide compared to OADs, 80 weeks versus 52 weeks. And after 104 weeks, fewer subjects discontinued prematurely, liraglutide compared to OAD. So clearly liraglutide has a superiority. It is there in every guideline after SGLT2, but I think GLP-1s have that superiority because it's injectable. We are still underplaying it. Safety to safety, well, treatment arm, rates of hypoglycemia and unexpected tolerability issues are all the same. So it's absolutely safe. Let's quickly look at Conclude. I'm not going to spend too much time on Conclude here because we all know about Conclude arms. It had its own challenges and own differences on daily dose of the trials, and it was a hypothesis generating trial on hypoglycemia. I think they are all the same. They're very, very similar insulins, and I think I would not put too much on the Conclude trial, but it's quite okay. They have done now cleaned up the data and they have come with some robust results that they are virtually the same, the second generation, new generation. The other big spotlight of the trial at the ADA was the dulaglutide arm, and that was a dulaglutide on kidney function related outcomes from the Rewind trial. And in the Rewind trial, dulaglutide very clearly showed that it had an impact on the endpoint of eGFR and ESRD at all-cause death. So looking at the 1:1 randomization, the kidney function related outcomes, they concluded that incidence of this composite endpoint was significantly lower in the dulaglutide arm, and it was having a 17% reduction in kidney related outcomes, delaying the diabetic kidney disease in people with type 2 diabetes with cardiovascular risk. Let us look at the last trial because it's all about time in range, and glycemic variability has a huge impact on progression of CKD, the Pearl sub-study. So this was something very, very useful, preventing early renal loss in diabetes, because all is about kidney, and we want to prevent that early kidney loss or the nephron loss in diabetes. And on the background of DKD, we know it impacts, and we know that if you do a good glycemic control with RAS inhibition, that has been the standard of care. And lot of advances have happened in DKD with additional treatments. So there have been lot of animal models, epidemiological studies which implicated high uric acid are etiologically relevant in DKD. So this whole Pearl study was looking at lower uric acid with allopurinol. Could it slow the glomerular filtration rate decline in type 1 diabetic patients with mild to moderate DKD? This was the study population looking at type 1 diabetes, eGFR between 40 to 100, some EKD, some albuminuria, some eGFR loss, and uric acid more than 4.5. So this is what was that, and they did CGM for 15 months with allopurinol versus placebo for 3 years and looked at kidney functions. And this is how the study outcome was. These were the baseline characteristics. They were all used the AGP machine, the glycemic excursions, the IGFR was very clearly linked, and clearly they showed that in type 1 diabetics to mild to moderate kidney disease, there is no evidence on that glycemic variability or glucose control impacts the rate of loss of IGFR. The limitations of the study was small observation studies, small sample size, CGM data was very variable, and short duration of observation. Let us look at the cutting edge new therapies, and that's something existing and emerging therapies. So one is of course the HypoDec trial, very good trial, excellent study on degludec and the CGM arm. And you have the HypoDec trial, the HypoDec CGM sub-study, Go-Bolus study, ONSET-9 trial. So those are the recent evidences. And then of course the feature of this year's ADA, predominantly the IcoDec or once a week basal insulin. So let us look at the effect of degludec on frequency of severe hypoglycemia in patients with type 1 diabetes prone to nocturnal severe hypoglycemia. So this is dedicated for nocturnal severe hypoglycemia and type 1 diabetes. So clearly again, we know the biggest rate limiting factor today in type 1 diabetes control is nocturnal hypoglycemia. We know that the newer analogs, clearly the glargine was the first one which showed that the nocturnal hypoglycemia was 1/3 less. Now can we say that the second generation agents will further reduce nocturnal hypoglycemia by 1/3? So 33% drop. Is that true? Is that false? There's a lot of questions, lot of debate on that, and this is one study addressing only that question. The newer long-acting degludec demonstrated with further reduction of nocturnal hypoglycemia, and that was investigated. This was compared with the standard glargine U100 on the risk of nocturnal hypoglycemia in type 1 diabetes, because type 1 diabetes, it really matters, the nocturnal hypoglycemia. So this was a classical study, maintenance phase of degludec versus glargine, adults above 18, type 1 diabetes for 5 years, more than one episode of nocturnal hypoglycemia which is severe in the preceding 2 years. And clearly this was a Danish initiated 10 center crossover trial. It was a probe trial. What do you mean by probe trial? Prospective randomized open blinded endpoint. and 1:1 ratio degludec versus glargine arm, and 2 years was the study duration. Most of them were males. Duration of diabetes around 28 months. A1C around 7.8. Hypoglycemic unawareness was 28%. Nocturnal severe hypo in the preceding 2 years. Episodes were around 2.3 plus or minus 2.2. Median of 1. So, what was looked at? Nocturnal symptomatic hypoglycemia in maintenance phase, and in the secondary endpoint, severe hypoglycemia in maintenance phase, non-severe hypoglycemia in maintenance phase. Hypoglycemia was assessed for severe hypoglycemia, which was reported below 70, below 54, symptomatic on a call center, non-severe on diary or SMBG measurements. And total hypoglycemic episodes which were analyzed were 136 severe hypoglycemias were reported in the maintenance periods, 41% with degludec, 59% in glargine group, with a relative risk ratio of 35%, thus p-value of 0.04. This corresponds with the absolute rate reduction of 0.3 episodes per patient with degludec. So obviously there is a clear direction here that probably degludec might be a little more safer on the nocturnal hypoglycemia side, and this is directly linked, and this is how the graphs look at on the distribution, and this is a significance because degludec in type 1, if you are getting recurrent nocturnal severe hypoglycemia, there is a clear reduction, absolute rate reduction, and number needed to treat to avoid one episode of all day severe hypoglycemia is 3 patients in 1 year. The same study was deep dive into the CGM because CGM gives us a lot of insights. And can optimal basal therapy reduce nocturnal hypoglycemia, and is it true that degludec causes lesser nocturnal hypo, and therefore this was a hypodec trial ka CGM arm, same arm which we just saw, and the flow of participants which were included in the analysis was 67, small group, and this was the coefficient of variation, stable glucose CV less than 36, unstable glucose more than 36. That's how they measure it when you do CGM. And the CGM classification of hypoglycemia less than 70, less than 54, symptomatic with diaries, blinded CGM, asymptomatic blinded CGM, and events occurring lasting greater than 15 minutes for 4 consecutive measurements. So this was the differentiation. Level 1 less than 70, level 2 less than 54, overall symptomatic plus asymptomatic, 24 hours, nocturnal, diurnal, and difference in coefficient of variation in different arms. So obviously looking at the sub-study metrics, these are the metrics, and clearly you can see that defining nighttime hypoglycemia is 11 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the morning, 193 episodes of nocturnal severe hypoglycemia with a threshold less than 3, multiply that by 18, and clearly you can see 53% relative risk reduction with degludec compared to insulin glargine. So it was 0.6 episodes per person per week compared to 1.3 episodes per person per week. So clearly this 52% reduction came from nocturnal asymptomatic hypoglycemia. So when it came to asymptomatic hypoglycemia, degludec probably had 0.4 episodes compared to glargine of 0.9 episodes. So obviously the next generation insulins make a difference, make an impact, and therefore whether degludec resulted in significantly lowering all day coefficient of variation compared to the nocturnal coefficient of variation is something which we know very well. So this was the unstable CV more than 36% versus the stable coefficient of variation, and when it comes to the coefficient of variation, clearly degludec scores over. So clearly this study showed in type 1 diabetes who have recurrent nocturnal severe hypoglycemia, degludec compared to the standard glargine, significant reduction in nocturnal non-severe hypoglycemia, asymptomatic at level 1 and 2, significant reduction in diurnal severe non-hypoglycemia, symptomatic at level 2, and significant reduction in nocturnal glycemic variability. So again, clear data to show that, very clearly showing this and this thing. Second, this study is the Go-Bolus study, impact of faster aspart in glycemic control in type 1 diabetes in basal bolus population with flash glucose monitoring. This was done by Thomas Dane and my good friend Matthias Exelsweiser, who is in Germany. So this was a German study from the Ziegler and the whole group from there, and clearly you can see that the faster aspart, we know the faster aspart is enhanced in a aspart formulation which have the excipients of niacinamide and L-arginine, and this is which has been very closely investigated, the faster aspart, and that has been significantly demonstrated to be non-inferior to insulin aspart for A1C. And adult and pediatric patients who received the faster aspart experienced better PPG. CGM was clearly used. So the go-to-bolus study had this MDI parameters. This was the AGP with the fast-acting insulin aspart, and clearly you can see the A1C coming down with the faster-acting the mean change, the aggregated FGM results, and this is the first study to investigate FASP in the real-world setting. Switching to FASP resulted a small but statistical reduction in the A1C over 24 weeks, and the time in range was clearly increased because the time in hyperglycemia without increasing time in hypoglycemia was modulated. So all what was achieved without switching basal insulins, without change in the mean overall insulin doses overall. So that was clearly the second study. The third study was from this Onset 9 trial, and this was Franek, Edward and the group, which looked at the fast-acting aspart on A1C with a basal bolus regimen. Again, similar data clearly showing the change of baseline after 1 hour PPG, and the hypoglycemia and the rate ratios. The rate of severe or blood glucose confirmed hypoglycemia was statistically significantly lower in FIASP group compared to the aspart group, and clearly that was observed. So faster aspart provides a overall effective glycemic control, and it is quicker and faster to reach the A1C targets. So if you want less hypoglycemia with a faster reduction, probably faster aspart or fast acting aspart is the way to go. Let me look at the last component of our ADA, because ADA was huge. We have a lot to discuss, but probably in a limited time we need to understand that there was one game changer at ADA, the data from once a week basal insulin, and that was icodec. And we are now 1 year away from century of insulin, and clearly the past and present of basal insulin innovation. So clearly we know NPH insulin had a half-life of 5 to 10 hours, can be given once or twice a day, causes a lot of nocturnal hypoglycemia. Then we moved to the first generation insulin analogs, whether it was typically the glargine, the Detimer. It has a half-life which is shorter, and it is OD or BID. Then we moved at the second generation basal analogs, whether it is degludec, whether it is probably the U300 glargine. They have 1 day of half-life once a day. But now we are moving to a half-life of 1 week, once a week icodec. So once a week versus once a day. How is it different? Okay, clinically, glycemic control has to be the same, but hypoglycemia risk has to be lower. Treatment burden will be reduced, and clinical inertia will be reduced. Imagine you just give once a week, every Saturday, the insulin is so easy to give. From a molecule standpoint, half-life will be longer, more stable PK/PD without any stacking, and slower clearance rate. So you have to use the human subcutaneous tissue as a reservoir for a appropriate release without causing hypoglycemia, better treatment acceptance and adherence. So how is icodec designed? Well, it was designed to have a higher half-life or a protracted or a longer half-life by introducing changes in the human insulin molecule. And clearly you can see here that this has the typical 7x oligoethylene glycol OG gamma glue spacer, and that spacer you can see here very clearly. And then there are, so first is the spacer, which is absolutely mandatory, the OG glue spacer as they call it, which you can see here in the nice pictorial. And then there are 3 amino acid substitutions. Again, I am putting it back that the Y is becoming E, the Y is becoming H, and the F is becoming the H. So 3 amino acid substitutions for what? For A, molecular stability, B, reduce enzyme degradation, C, reduce receptor mediated clearance. So stable molecule, less degradable for the enzyme, and the receptor mediated clearance is also less. So it will be protracted action at the receptor, the enzyme degradation will be lesser, so again it will be having a longer half-life, and the molecule will be stable. Then the B99, B29, after that the B30T has been removed. So removal of the terminal threonine and linking it, the B19, to a spacer, which is the C20 icosane fatty diacid. See, Novo has pioneered in fatty acid diacids, which is based on albumin. And this C20 icosane fatty diacid is a strong reversible binding to albumin, and that reduces the receptor mediated clearance. It may also have some neurological implications, which may be very, very good, giving it some amount of weight stability. So let me go back. What is going to be this thing? They have the classical OG gamma glue spacer, 3 amino acids substituted, EHH, stable molecule, less enzyme degradation, reduced receptor mediated clearance. Then the threonine at 10, the T is gone, and you have a spacer with C20 icosane fatty diacid, which is a albumin binder with lesser receptor mediated resistance. This is the pharmacokinetics which was presented by the Japanese scientists. You can see here very clearly the NPH, which is brown, detimir, which is green, the degludec, which is blue, and you can see here the insulin 338, which is the C18 isophane, and then you move up to the C20. So we have actually moved from C14 diacid, which was the detimir, and the same stable then met degludec, which was around C16, to C18 and C20, and this is where we are today as we approach a century, that the preclinical study shows that the increased albumin binding C20 gives icodec a longer half-life. So when you give the first injection of icodec, look at it. You are injecting it in the subcutaneous tissue space. Okay, let us go back. You are injecting it. Can you see it inside being injected? And this formulation ensures the injection volume is similar to once a day. So it will stay there in the subcutaneous tissue space. After the injection, the hexamers will slowly dissociate into monomers and bind to albumin. Although a week's worth of insulin is administered, almost all icodec is albumin bound to form an inactive depot. So they are all inactive depots, and then very slowly a small fraction of icodec reaches the insulin receptors to reach the target tissues, stimulating glucose lowering. So this is how it works. It's very, very novel. Let me put it. This is using the insulin in the subcutaneous tissue space. It injects the hexamer to dissociate into monomers binding albumin. So they have gone here. You can see all the glue, and they have formed inactive depots. And very slowly, ekdam slowly, they will be reaching the insulin receptors at the target tissues, stimulating the glucose lowering. That is what happens. Is there a build-up after 2 to 3 injections? When you give the second injection, more icodec is added to the inactive albumin depot. So what's happening is, it is going and getting stored in the depot, and a slower clearance of icodec via the insulin receptor further contributes the build-up of albumin-bound icodec. And the glucose lowering effect will slowly increase when they interact with the insulin receptor. So obviously on the second dose it will be the same, and after 3 to 4 injections there will be a full-fledged steady state with the full effect of icodec dose, and this will be like a icodec albumin bound depot. So you are actually building your own body's human tissue in the subcutaneous tissue space, blood vessel, and the insulin receptor. For actually you are building a pump within a pump. You are using our own bodies to actually have a targeted insulin delivery inside the body, and that is something very unique. So once you achieve the steady state after 3 to 4 injections, the variations in dose time and amount leading to minimal changes will be absolutely gone, and you will get a sustained glucose lowering effect. So it is same signaling and action of human insulin on the human receptor binding. The IGF to R binding ratio is less than 1. So the metabolic effects are pronounced, and the mitogenic potency is less than 1. So clearly this is a game changer. Okay, it's a clear game changer. icodec is based on human insulin with 3 amino acid substitution to prevent enzyme degradation. They are very stable. We have added a C20 fatty acid diacid to build a very strong reversible albumin binding with reducing the reduced clearance. Gradual continuous release active icodec is albumin bound to the inactive depot, and steady state has approached in 3 to 4 weeks on the icodec very clearly. So I think I'll stop here because there is so much to discuss, so much to talk.